So question 11, Christian used Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient to, this is really blurry, to compare the use of public transport with the use of private vehicles for travel to work in the UK. There's some stuff. Explain in context why you would expect strong positive correlation between X and Y. That is, the number of employees using public transport and the number of employees using private vehicles. Okay, for all 348 UK local authorities. This is just the number, straightforward number. It's not talking about the percentage or the proportion. It's just talking about the raw totals. So you would expect that in local authorities with more people, there would be more people using transport of both types. Does that make sense? So you would expect a strong positive correlation because it's just talking about the raw numbers. So they depend on the population in the local authority. So as the population rises, both of them would rise. So they'd have a positive correlation. Does that make sense? Do we need to write anything down for that? Both X and Y depend on the size of the local authority population. So as one increases, the other would increase. There we go. The important thing to note there was it was about number. Oh, it was about number rather than proportion that we were dealing with, and that was the key there. Explain in context what kind of correlation to expect from A and B. Well, now we're talking about proportion of employees using public transport and proportion of employees using private vehicles. So now you would expect that the higher the proportion of people using public transport, that would take people away from private vehicles. More people using private vehicles would take people away from public transport. So when you talk about proportion as opposed to number, you'd expect a negative correlation. So for part B, we're expecting a negative correlation. The higher the proportion of public transport, you would expect fewer people to drive. If a large proportion use public transport, fewer would be available to drive. Fewer would use private vehicles. The key in looking at that was that difference between number and proportion. Okay, part 2. Krista also considered the data for 33 London boroughs. So we're now talking about London boroughs, and so by that we're now zooming in on urban areas. Okay, so dense population, lots of people travelling to work, that kind of thing. She generated the following scatter diagram. One London borough is represented as an outlier. So there's the outlier. Suggest what effect this outlier is likely to have on the value of R for the 32 London boroughs. Actually, there's a key thing here, isn't there? That if you notice, this is part B of the previous question. This is the proportion driving and the proportion using public transport. It's that. It's A and B from there. And you've got a negative correlation. So the answer to that previous part was actually kind of given a little bit in this, although this is just the London boroughs as opposed to the whole country. We've got an outlier. Suggest what effect this outlier has on the value of R. So the value of R there is negative. That's a crucial thing, because this is, as one of these increases, the other one decreases. So R is already negative. The outlier means that we are less close to a straight line than we previously were. So if this was a perfect straight line, R would be -1. The more points that are away from a straight line, the less close to -1 it is. So that outlier would take the value of R further away from -1. That's not decreasing the value of R, that's actually increasing it towards 0. Does that make sense? So it is making R closer to 0 and less negative. Okay. There's a difficult one here that I think somebody put an answer of makes R more positive. And I'm not sure that they really understood that that was exactly what they meant, but it's the right answer. Although R isn't positive, so actually it's kind of dubious, isn't it? Because is it making it more positive when it isn't positive to start with? So it's a tricky one. But anyway, you get the idea that because R would be something like -0.9 at the moment without that outlier, it's making R closer to 0. So you're moving it to -0.7 or 0.6, something like that. Suggest what effect this outlier is likely to have on the value of R for the whole country. Well, for the whole country, you've got a massively increased amount. Makes R less negative. Is that all right? Suggest what effect the outlier is likely to have for the whole country. Massive amount of data now. You would expect in other areas that are less built up that this isn't quite as marked, as strong a correlation. So one outlier, when you're looking at the whole country, would have a tiny effect. So they really wanted you to say very little effect or negligible effect. I was allowing people who said that it would still make R increase close to 0 by a tiny, insignificant amount. But for the whole country, very, very little effect. What can you deduce about the area of the London Borough represented by the outlier? Explain your answer. What we can't see in this is anything about raw numbers. So we can't talk about the actual numbers of how many people are doing things. All that we've got from this is that there's a very low proportion driving and a higher proportion using public transport. The proportion using public transport isn't greater than any of the other London boroughs. In fact, it's one of the smallest of all the London boroughs. And yet there's very, very low proportion driving. So people must be doing something else. And that's the thing to draw from it. So people must be either walking to work or jobs are really close. They're finding something to do other than using public transport or driving. Cycling. So something along the lines of people are walking, cycle, jobs are close by, those kind of ideas. People are travelling short distances, yeah, that kind of idea. Or something along the lines of saying why so few people drive, which could be that it's very hard to own a car in that London borough. There are no parking spaces, no off-street parking. It's expensive to own a car. There are taxations on owning cars in that borough, or something along those lines. The thingy charge, the congestion charge. Yeah, right, and that's that.